My name is Mark Thompson, and at 58 years old, I thought I understood the bedrock of my life. I believed it was built on two things: the foundation of the construction business I'd bled for, and the unconditional love for my daughter, Chloe. For 26 years, especially the last 12 since her mother passed, Chloe had been the entire blueprint of my existence. Every nail I hammered, every beam I hoisted, was to build a world for her that was safe and secure. The day she called to tell me she was engaged, my world felt complete. The final, beautiful rooftop had been placed on the structure of my life. I adored her fiancé, Liam. He was handsome, ambitious, an investment banker from a family that oozed old money and quiet confidence. He seemed to be everything I wasn't: polished, educated in the Ivy Leagues, a man who worked with numbers, not his hands. But he made my daughter happy, and for a simple contractor like me, that was the only credential that mattered. I had welcomed him into my home, the small but sturdy brick house I'd built with my late wife, Helen. I'd shared stories of Chloe's childhood over beers on the back porch, treating him like the son I never had. So when I called her on that crisp October Tuesday, my heart was full, my mind buzzing with the happy logistics of fatherhood. I was picturing venues and guest lists, ready to give her the wedding Helen had always dreamed of for her. "Hey, sweetie," I said, leaning against the tailgate of my work truck, the scent of sawdust still clinging to my clothes. "Just calling to check in. I was thinking we should probably start talking about a date for the engagement dinner. Get both families together." There was a brief, almost imperceptible pause on the other end of the line. Then Chloe's voice, bright and breezy, a tone she used when she was trying to skim over something. "Oh," she said, with a little laugh that didn't quite land. "We had it yesterday. The world didn't stop. The traffic on the freeway a block away didn't cease its roar. The sun didn't fall from the sky. But in the small, quiet space of my own heart, a 30-year structure of love and trust imploded, turning instantly to dust. Yesterday," I repeated, my voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to another man. "Yeah, it was just a small thing," she rushed on, the words tumbling over each other. "Liam's parents, the Hamiltons, they're very traditional and wanted to do something intimate at their club right away. It was all very last minute. I was going to call you today. The lie was so casual, so effortless. It was almost impressive. Last minute. Intimate. Words designed to soften a blow that felt like a sledgehammer to the chest. I could hear the falseness in her voice, the carefully rehearsed script. In that moment, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sun, I understood that I had not just been forgotten. I had been deliberately excluded. And as I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, a cold, hard clarity began to settle in the void where my paternal joy had been. My daughter was ashamed of me, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was not her idea alone. This had the polished, condescending fingerprints of the Hamiltons all over it. I ended the call with a quiet, "Okay, sweetie. Talk soon," my voice a marvel of self-control. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I just let the silence on my end of the line speak for me. Because in the deafening quiet that followed, a new blueprint was beginning to form in my mind. They wanted to build a new life on a foundation that excluded me. They had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who owned the land, supplied the materials, and held the permit for every single thing they had. And I was about to issue a stop work order on their entire future. The days that followed that phone call were a masterclass in deception, but not on Chloe's part. It was on mine. I wrapped myself in a cloak of feigned ignorance, playing the role of the slightly hurt but ultimately understanding father. I became the man they expected me to be, simple, a little slow on the uptake, a man easily placated by a few kind words and a condescending pat on the head. When Chloe called a few days later, her voice laced with a cloying, artificial sweetness, I played my part perfectly. "Dad, I feel so terrible about the dinner," she said. "It all just happened so fast. You know how the Hamiltons are. They just take over." I made a sound of gentle protest. "It's okay, sweetie. Don't you worry about it. As long as you're happy, that's all that matters." I could almost hear the sigh of relief on the other end of the line. The obstacle of the simple-minded father had been successfully navigated. They could now proceed with their plans, confident that the family ATM was still online and operational. But while I was being the docile, accommodating father to her face, I was becoming something else entirely in the shadows. I became a detective in my own life, searching for the truth I already knew in my gut. The first piece of evidence came, as it so often does in this modern age, from social media. Liam's mother, Eleanor Hamilton, had a public Instagram profile. It was a curated gallery of her perfect, privileged life. Charity galas, European vacations, and tennis matches at the country club. And there it was, posted on Monday evening, just hours after the intimate, last-minute dinner. It was a photo of a long, elegantly set table in a private room. Crystal glasses sparkled, and a ridiculously expensive-looking floral arrangement served as the centerpiece. Liam and Chloe were in the middle, beaming. Flanking them were Eleanor and her husband, Richard, along with a dozen or so of their equally polished and wealthy-looking friends. My daughter was radiant, her smile wide and genuine. She looked completely at home, not a flicker of guilt or sadness in her eyes that her own father was missing. But it was the caption that truly twisted the knife. Eleanor had written, "A perfect evening celebrating Liam and our lovely Chloe. So wonderful to welcome her into the real family, the real family." The words were a declaration of war, a clear line drawn in the sand. I was the other family, the rough-edged, working-class father who didn't fit into their pristine picture. I printed the photo and the caption, the ink on the paper feeling as permanent and damning as a court verdict. My next step was a visit to my sister, Susan. She was a fiery, no-nonsense lawyer who had been my rock since Helen died. She'd always been a bit wary of Liam, seeing a flicker of arrogance in his eyes that I had dismissed as confidence. I laid the story out on her kitchen table, the phone call, the Instagram post, my growing suspicions. She listened in silence, her expression hardening with every word. When I finished, she didn't offer sympathy. She offered fury, and it was exactly what I needed. "They see you as a checkbook, Mark," she said, her voice tight with anger. "A stepping stone. You built Chloe's entire life, and now that she's upgrading to this new family, they think they can just discard you. You cannot let that happen. What do I do, Susan?" I asked, the question feeling heavy and hopeless. "You do nothing," she said, a strategic glint in her eyes. "You keep playing the part. You let them think they're in complete control. You let them make their plans, their big, expensive plans. And in the meantime, we get our own plans in order. We review every single financial tie you have to that girl and her smug fiancé." And so we did. Over the next few weeks, Susan and I conducted a quiet audit of my life and my generosity. The results were staggering, even to me. First, there was the condo. After Chloe graduated, I bought a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a desirable neighborhood for her, a place where she could start her adult life without the burden of rent. The deed, of course, was solely in my name. She was, legally speaking, a tenant with no lease. Then there was the wedding fund. Years ago, Helen and I had set up a trust. It wasn't a massive fortune, but it was a substantial amount, a nest egg specifically designated for Chloe's future wedding. Helen, always the more cautious one, had insisted on a peculiar clause. To release the funds, the trust required the signatures of 2 family members, myself and my sister, Susan. Furthermore, a small, almost poetic subclause stated that the funds were intended to celebrate a union that honors and respects the bonds of family. As I sat in Susan's office, looking at the legal documents, the cold, hard anger that had taken root in my heart began to solidify into a plan. A plan that was methodical, precise, and devastating. Chloe and Liam, in their rush to ascend to a higher social stratosphere, had forgotten that their rocket was still attached to my launch pad, and I was about to cut the engines. They thought they had left me behind. They had no idea I was the only thing holding them up. The invitation to the meeting arrived via a crisp email from Liam. The subject line read, "Wedding planning, Phase 1. He wrote that his parents wanted to host a preliminary budget discussion at their country club the following Saturday." The tone was one of casual command, as if my attendance and More importantly, my financial participation were foregone conclusions. I replied with a simple, "Sounds great." Looking forward to it. I spent the week preparing, not by looking at my bank accounts, but by stealing my heart. This was the hardest part. I had to sit across from my own daughter, the child I had taught to ride a bike and helped with her algebra homework, and pretend that I was nothing more than a willing participant in her grand illusion. I had to smile and nod as they discussed the erasure of my family's meaning, the reduction of my life's work to a series of line items on a budget sheet. The Oak Ridge Country Club was exactly as you would imagine it, a sprawling oasis of manicured green lawns and hushed, cavernous rooms where the air smelled of old money and lemon polish. I felt out of place the moment I pulled my Ford F-150 into the parking lot, slotting it between a gleaming black Mercedes and a dark green Jaguar. I walked into the private dining room they had reserved, and the scene was set. Richard and Eleanor Hamilton sat at the head of a long mahogany table. Liam and Chloe were on one side, looking like a perfectly matched set from a catalog. They had even hired a wedding planner, a severe-looking woman with a sharp bob and an iPad, who was already tapping away at the screen. "Mark, glad you could make it," Richard Hamilton boomed, standing to shake my hand. His grip was firm, his smile wide, but his eyes were dismissive. They scanned my simple blazer and clean work pants with the speed of a human barcode reader, calculating my net worth and finding it wanting. I took my seat, a single island of denim and calloused hands in their ocean of cashmere and silk. For the next hour, I listened. I listened as they talked about a guest list of 300 people, most of whom were their friends and business associates. I listened as Eleanor described a vision for the floral arrangements that would cost more than my first truck. I listened as the wedding planner, a woman named Beatrice, presented a preliminary budget that made my head spin. $300,000. They presented it not as a question, but as a statement of fact. This was what the wedding would cost. This was what was required. "Of course, this is just a starting point," Beatrice said, looking at me over the top of her glasses. "But to secure the key vendors, the venue, the caterer, the photographer, we'll need to put down deposits of around 50% within the next 30 days. Richard leaned forward, a conspiratorial smile on his face. "Now, Mark, we know this is a big number. Eleanor and I are, of course, happy to contribute. We thought we would cover the rehearsal dinner and the honeymoon. A nice trip to Tuscany, perhaps," he paused for effect, "and we assumed you'd be handling the main event itself." As is traditional for the father of the bride, I looked at my daughter. She was staring down at her hands, refusing to meet my eyes. She knew this was wrong. A part of her, the little girl I had raised, had to know, but she remained silent, a willing accomplice in her own father's fleecing. This was the moment to speak up, to unleash the torrent of anger and hurt that was raging inside me. But I remembered Susan's advice. Not yet. Let them lay all their cards on the table. So I play my part. I picked up the ridiculously thick binder Beatrice had prepared. I flipped through the pages, feigning a thoughtful consideration. I whistled softly. "Wow, that's a lot of money," I said, channeling the simple, overwhelmed contractor they believed me to be. "I'll have to, look at my finances. Move some things around." Liam reached across the table and patted my hand, a gesture of such profound condescension it almost made me break character. "Don't worry, Mark," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "We know you'll do the right thing for your little girl. This is her dream. After all, my little girl. Her dream." I looked at the budget again, at the line item for a $10,000 ice sculpture of a swan, and I wondered when her dreams had become so cold, so brittle, so completely disconnected from the life of warmth and love we had shared. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "For Chloe." Anything, the relief in the room was palpable. The Hamiltons exchanged a look of triumph. Liam squeezed Chloe's shoulder. The final obstacle had been cleared. The checkbook had confirmed it was still open for business. I left the country club that day with the heavy binder tucked under my arm and a lump of ice in my stomach. They had no idea what was coming. They were celebrating a victory in a game they didn't even know they were playing. They were planning the wedding of the century, a grand monument to their social status. But they were building it on a sinkhole, and I was the one standing by, ready to watch it all get swallowed whole. The weeks between the budget meeting and the final confrontation were a quiet, agonizing crawl. I continued to play the part of the compliant father, exchanging occasional texts with Chloe about minor wedding details, always keeping my tone positive and accommodating. They were lulled into a complete sense of security. As far as they were concerned, the money was a done deal, and I was just the slightly overwhelmed but ultimately dutiful old man who would provide it. Behind the scenes, however, Susan and I were fortifying our position. We had a formal eviction notice drawn up by a lawyer in her firm for the condo. It was dated and ready to be served the moment I gave the word. We also drafted a letter, a formal statement from the trustees of Helen's wedding fund, that is, from Susan and me, explaining in cold, legal terms why the conditions for releasing the funds had not been met, citing the clause about honoring and respecting the bonds of family. Everything was in place. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to detonate it all. That moment came in the form of another email from Liam. The subject, final vendor meeting and deposit authorization. The wedding planner, Beatrice, had scheduled a meeting at her upscale downtown office to sign the final contracts and authorize the initial wire transfers, a sum totaling $150,000. All the key players will be there, Liam wrote. You, me, Chloe, and my parents. Let's get this done and start the real celebration. The final meeting. The perfect stage for the final act of this tragedy. I arrived at Beatrice's office 5 minutes early. It was a sterile, all-white space that felt more like a modern art gallery than a business. I was the first one there, and I took a seat at the long glass conference table, placing my worn leather briefcase beside me. The Hamiltons arrived next, sweeping in with an air of self-importance, followed by Liam and Chloe. My daughter looked beautiful, but there was a new hardness in her eyes, a brittle quality I had never seen before. She gave me a quick, almost rehearsed hug before taking her seat next to Liam, creating a clear physical divide between us. The meeting began with Beatrice, the wedding planner, walking us through the final contracts. She spoke in a rapid-fire, jargon-filled monologue about floral installations, lighting design, and catering logistics. I let the words wash over me, my focus entirely on the stack of papers in front of me and the wire transfer authorization form on top, a form that required my signature. After about 20 minutes of her presentation, Richard Hamilton cleared his throat, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Beatrice, this is all wonderful," he said with an impatient wave of his hand. "But let's get to the brass tacks. We're all busy people. Mark, are you ready to sign off on the transfers so we can get these vendors locked in?" This was it, the moment of truth. I looked at Richard, at his smug, expectant face. I looked at Eleanor, who was examining her manicure with an air of profound boredom. I looked at Liam, who was already mentally spending my money. And then I looked at my daughter. "Actually," I said, my voice quiet but clear, cutting through the sterile silence of the room. "Before we sign anything, there's another event I'd like to discuss." Beatrice looked annoyed at the interruption. Richard raised an eyebrow. "And what's that, Mark?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my own folder. From it, I took the glossy printout of Eleanor's Instagram post. I slid it across the glass table. It came to a stop directly in front of Chloe. "This one," I said. "The engagement dinner. The one for the real family." The effect was instantaneous. The air in the room crackled and turned to ice. Chloe stared at the picture as if it were a venomous snake, all the color draining from her face. Liam's jaw tightened. Eleanor Hamilton's bored expression vanished, replaced by a flash of pure fury at being caught. Richard stared at me, his eyes narrowing, finally realizing that the simple contractor was not so simple after all. "I don't know what you're trying to imply, Mark," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I'm not implying anything, Richard," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "I'm stating a fact. While you were all celebrating at your exclusive club, I was at home, alone. The father of the bride, the man you expect to fund this entire spectacle, wasn't deemed worthy of an invitation. It was a misunderstanding," Chloe whispered, her eyes pleading with me. "It was last minute, was it?" I asked, my gaze unwavering. "Because this post from Eleanor suggests it was a celebration of the real family." "Tell me, Chloe, am I not your real family? Is the man who raised you, who supported you, who loved you unconditionally, suddenly not real enough for the Hamiltons? I let the question hang in the air, a devastating indictment of her betrayal. Eleanor Hamilton, recovering her composure, sniffed dismissively. Oh, for heaven's sake, Mark, don't be so dramatic. It was a simple get-together. We just didn't think you would be comfortable. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You're right. I wouldn't have been comfortable. Because I'm not comfortable with people who are so bankrupt in character that they think a man's worth is measured by the balance in his bank account. I'm not comfortable with a family that teaches my daughter that it's acceptable to discard her own father because he works with his hands. I stood up, my own hands resting on the cool glass of the table. And since we're talking about comfort, let's talk about yours. I turned to Liam and Chloe. I hope you've been comfortable in the condo I bought. The one that is solely in my name. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out the eviction notice, sliding across the table toward them. You have 30 days to vacate. I'm selling it, Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Liam stared at the document, his face a mask of disbelief. You can't do that, he stammered. Oh, I can, I said. And I have, finally. I turned my attention back to the wire transfer form and the wedding contracts. I picked up a pen from the table, and for a heart-stopping moment, they thought I was going to sign. Instead, I drew a single, thick black line through the signature box. Then I looked at Richard and Eleanor. As for this wedding, I announced to the stunned room. It seems there's been a misunderstanding about the funding. I pulled out the letter from the trust, co-signed by my sister. Helen's wedding trust for Chloe is contingent upon a union that honors and respects the bonds of family my sister and I, as the trustees, have concluded that this condition has not been met. Therefore, no funds will be released. Not one single penny. I let my gaze rest on my daughter one last time. Her face was streaked with tears, a portrait of belated regret. You wanted a wedding to impress your new, real family, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, filled more with sorrow than anger. Well, now you can have one. A wedding you can all afford on your own. You have chosen your family, Chloe, and I am choosing mine. I am choosing to honor the memory of your mother and the values she stood for. Respect, loyalty, and love. Things, it seems, that money can't buy. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the ruins of their grand plans. The silence I left in my wake was more profound than any shouting match could ever be. It was the sound of consequences, a sound they were about to become very familiar with. The world I walked out into felt different. The air seemed cleaner, the sky brighter. A weight I hadn't even been fully aware I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time since Chloe's engagement, I felt like myself again. I didn't stick around to watch the immediate fallout. I didn't need to. I could picture it perfectly. The sputtering rage of the Hamiltons, the panicked disbelief of Liam, and the crumbling, tearful realization of my daughter as she finally understood the full scope of what she had lost. The practical consequences of my decision unfolded with a swift and satisfying finality. The $300,000 wedding was, of course, canceled. Beatrice, the wedding planner, called me the next day, her professional demeanor cracked with a hint of panic, asking about the deposits. I calmly explained that I would not be paying for any services and that any contractual issues were now the responsibility of the Hamiltons and their future son-in-law. I heard through the grapevine that the Hamiltons lost a significant amount in non-refundable deposits, a financial sting that, for people so obsessed with money, was likely more painful than any emotional slight. True to my word, the eviction notice was formally served. Chloe and Liam were forced to scramble, moving out of the beautiful condo and into a small, cramped apartment rented in Liam's name. The sale of the condo was quick, the market being what it was. I took the proceeds and invested them, setting up a new trust, this one in my name, to be used for causes Helen would have supported, scholarships for young women entering the trades, and a donation to the hospice that had cared for her so wonderfully in her final days. The true implosion, however, was in the relationship between Chloe and Liam. Stripped of the financial windfall they had been banking on, their perfect romance revealed itself to be a shallow, transactional arrangement. Susan told me that she had heard from a mutual acquaintance that the arguments were constant and vicious. Liam, his true colors shining through, reportedly blamed Chloe for everything. He accused her of mishandling me, of not being persuasive enough to secure the funding for the lifestyle he felt he deserved. Without my money to smooth over the cracks in their foundation, their relationship crumbled under the weight of his greed and her regret. They broke off the engagement less than 3 months after that final meeting. Liam, I heard, quickly moved on, finding another young woman from a wealthy family to attach himself to. He was a parasite, and he had simply found a new host. Chloe's journey was harder. She had to get a real job, working as a junior marketing assistant, a world away from the life of leisure and luxury she had envisioned with Liam. She was humbled, forced to confront the reality of the choices she had made. For 6 months, we had no contact. It was a painful, necessary silence. I needed the space to heal, and she needed the space to grow. Then, one rainy Saturday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Chloe standing on my porch, drenched and shivering, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She didn't look like the polished, confident woman from the country club. She looked like the little girl who used to run to me when she fell off her bike, her knees scraped and her heart broken. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Can I come in?" We sat in the living room, in the quiet comfort of the home where I had raised her. She cried for a long time, and I just sat with her, letting her pour out all the shame, the regret, and the heartbreak. She told me everything, how she had been so intimidated by the Hamiltons, so desperate for their approval, how Liam had convinced her that I was holding her back, that my simple, working-class life was an embarrassment she needed to transcend. "He made me feel like your love wasn't enough," she sobbed, "and I was stupid enough to believe him. I was so ashamed of you, Dad, and now I'm just so ashamed of myself. I threw away the only person who ever truly loved me for people who didn't care about me at all." I listened, and as I heard the genuine remorse in her voice, the icy anger that had protected my heart for months began to thaw. I saw my daughter again, not the stranger she had become, but the child I had raised, a good person who had made a terrible, life-altering mistake. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not a single event. It's a process, a long and winding road. Our relationship didn't snap back into place overnight. It took time, effort, and many long, difficult conversations. She had to earn back my trust, not with words, but with actions. She worked hard at her job. She insisted on paying me a token amount of rent for the years she had lived in the condo, a gesture I knew was more about her own need for atonement than my need for the money. She started volunteering at the hospice with me on weekends. Slowly, painstakingly, we began to rebuild the foundation that had crumbled. We started a new tradition, a simple Sunday dinner, just the two of us, in the small brick house that had always been our true home. We talked about her mother, about the future, about the hard-learned lessons of the past. One evening, about a year after she had shown up on my doorstep, we were cleaning up after dinner when she turned to me, her eyes clear and steady. "Thank you, Dad," she said. "For what, sweetie?" "For not letting me get away with it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength I hadn't heard in years. "For showing me what was real. You taught me that respect is more valuable than any amount of money. You saved me from a life that would have destroyed me in that moment. I knew that all the pain had been worth it. My revenge had never been about the money or about punishing my daughter. It had been about reclaiming my own dignity and reminding her of the values her mother and I had worked so hard to instill in her. It was a brutal, painful lesson, but it was one that had ultimately brought my daughter back to me, stronger, wiser, and more humble than before. My name is Mark Thompson, and I built my life with my own 2 hands. And when it was threatened, when the very foundation of my family was about to be bulldozed by greed and arrogance, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is to tear it all down in order to build it back up, stronger and truer than it was before.